Don't let go! I'm trying. The current's too strong.
I'll raise you $20.
I'm out.
The cold was killing him. James Dalton's lungs screamed for air as the Sacramento River dragged him under for the third time. His wedding boots, the expensive leather ones he'd polished obsessively every morning for 6 months because it was something to do, something to control, had filled with water and become anchors pulling him toward the muddy bottom. The wool coat Sarah had given him 3 years ago, the one that still carried the ghost of her lavender perfume, had absorbed half the river and wrapped around his arms like iron chains. He tried to kick, but the leather chaps designed to protect a cattleman's legs now squeezed his thighs so tight he couldn't spread his knees. The gun belt with its remaining Colt revolver and ammunition dragged at his waist, pulling him sideways, pulling him down. He'd stopped fighting now. Stopped trying to swim, though he'd never learned how anyway. Most cowboys couldn't. Swimming wasn't something you needed when your whole life happened on horseback under an empty sky. Through the dark water, James could almost see her. Sarah standing in their bedroom doorway, backlit by lamplight. Emma beside her, holding that orange kitten gap-toothed smile bright as Texas sunshine. They'd been gone 6 months. Scarlet fever had taken Emma first, then Sarah. 3 days later, her heart broken beyond what medicine could fix. Maybe it was right that the river was taking him too. Maybe this was how it was supposed to end. His coat snagged on something, a submerged branch, part of an old beaver dam. It jerked him to a violent stop. His face broke the surface. He gasped, choked, vomited whiskey and river water. The current still pulled at him, trying to finish the job, but the branch held. The sky above was turning gray. Dawn coming. His lips were blue. His fingers had no feeling. Hypothermia was setting in and consciousness was fading like smoke. This was it then. This was where James Dalton's story ended, drunk, drowning, and utterly alone in a river that didn't care about his grief. Except, through the morning fog, a figure appeared on the riverbank. Dark-haired, moving with purpose. A woman. She saw him. Their eyes met across 50 feet of water, and everything changed. 12 hours earlier. The Golden Eagle Saloon smelled like hell's outhouse. James pushed through the batwing doors into a wall of sensory assault. Tobacco smoke hung thick enough to cut with a knife. Unwashed bodies, 24 men who considered bathing a monthly luxury at best, mixed with spilled alcohol, the sickly sweet perfume the saloon girls wore, and something else underneath it all. Something organic and rotting that no amount of whiskey could cover up. He didn't care. He'd been coming here every night for 6 months. Same time, same corner table, same bottomless thirst that never got satisfied. The main street outside had been a churned-up river of mud mixed with horse manure 3 inches deep in places. 2,000 horses, mules, and oxen moved through Sacramento daily, and every one of them left their calling card. The rangy pigs that served as the town's only sanitation crew rooted through garbage piles while the spring fog rolled in from the river, thick and cold and promising. Inside wasn't much better. The floor stuck to James's boots, decades of spilled beer and God knows what creating an organic glue. He passed the bar where a filthy towel hung on a nail, its original color lost under layers of tobacco juice and beer drippings. Every drunk in town had used that towel tonight. It would hang there until it literally fell apart. James made his way to his corner table, the one that had become his throne of misery. He sat heavily and pulled out the small leather-bound photograph, the only thing besides his wedding ring that he carried everywhere now. Sarah caught mid-laugh, her hand on Emma's shoulder. Emma holding a kitten 8 years old, whole life ahead of her. The photograph was creased from being held too many times by hands that shook. He propped it against the empty bottle from last night. Evening Jim. Ned the bartender didn't ask what he wanted anymore. Just brought the bottle. But tonight's bottle looked different. The liquid inside was amber-colored but cloudy. Sediment floated near the bottom. This wasn't the expensive stuff from Kentucky. This was what the locals called rotgut or coffin varnish, and the names weren't jokes. What James didn't know or knew but didn't care was that Ned's house whiskey started life as industrial grain alcohol. Ned cut it with river water, added burned sugar for color, tobacco juice for that authentic whiskey tinge, chili peppers to make it burn going down, and a pinch of gunpowder for kick. 2 prospectors had gone blind from it last year. A cowboy died of alcohol poisoning 3 months back. James poured anyway. The first shot scorched all the way down, making his eyes water and his throat seize. But then came the numbness he needed, spreading from his chest outward like frost on a window. The second shot went down easier. The third easier still. Buy a lady a drink, Cowboy. She couldn't have been more than 22, but looked 40 in the greasy yellow lamplight. Blonde hair that might have come from a bottle dress, cut low enough to be clear about her profession. Her name was Lucy or Daisy or Sally, he couldn't remember. Didn't matter, probably made up anyway. No thank you, ma'am. But Ned brought her a drink regardless. Cold tea dyed brown to look like whiskey. She'd get a commission on every fake drink she sold. The saloon's way of separating drunk men from their money. She sat down uninvited, saw the photograph, and her painted smile faltered. Oh, sorry. James didn't respond, just poured another drink. The piano player murdered another song. Someone shouted about a cheating card game. Glass shattered somewhere. The normal symphony of the Golden Eagle on a Saturday night. Shot 4. Or was it 5? His hands were starting to shake less. Or maybe more, hard to tell. Around him, the saloon was packed with men running from something. The old Confederate veteran who drank to forget Shiloh. The farmer whose crops failed 3 years running. The gambler who owed money to the wrong people. All of them here paying 4 bits for liquid amnesia. James kept drinking. Shot 6, his vision blurred at the edges. Sarah's face in the photograph seemed to move, her smile shifting. Or was that just the lamp flames flickering? Shot 7. His hands went numb. The burn in his throat had been replaced by a general absence of feeling. This was the goal. The sweet spot where memory couldn't quite reach him. Where Emma's last cough didn't echo in his ears. Where Sarah's final words, "Take care of yourself." James couldn't make him feel like he'd failed. Shot 8. 9. He'd lost count. When he tried to stand the floor, tilted violently. He sat back down hard. "Jim, maybe you should sleep it off here tonight." A regular at the next table offered. "Got a cot in the back? I'm fine," James slurred. "Just need air." Second attempt, he made it to his feet. The room swam like he was on a ship in a storm. His expensive wool coat hung heavy on his shoulders. His gun belt sagged with the weight of twin Colts and ammunition. His wedding boots felt like they belonged to someone else's feet. He bumped into a table, knocked over someone's beer, mumbled an apology, made it to the door. "Jim, you forgot your photograph." He turned back, moving underwater slow, and picked up the leather frame with exaggerated care, tucked it inside his coat over his heart. The one thing he couldn't leave behind, even when he wished he could leave everything behind. The evening air hit him like a slap. It wasn't actually fresh, still carried that smell of manure and rot, but after the concentrated funk of the saloon, it felt almost breathable. But which direction was home? James stepped off the boardwalk and immediately sank ankle-deep into the mud and manure mixture that passed for Sacramento's main street. Each step required conscious effort. Lift, move, plant, sink, repeat. The wool coat that had weighed maybe 5 pounds dry now felt like 15. It had absorbed moisture from the saloon's humidity, his own sweat, the evening fog. The gun belt with its twin Colts added another 8 pounds. The chaps he'd worn for work and never taken off encased his legs like armor. In total, James Dalton was carrying about 30 extra pounds of clothing, leather, and steel. On a sober man, manageable. On a man who'd consumed half a bottle of Ned's rot gut, it was like wearing chains. He stumbled past familiar landmarks. The butcher shop closed now, but still reeking of blood and sawdust. The general store's dark windows reflecting his ghost-like shape coat, hanging open hat, missing beard, wild eyes sunken. The Chinese laundry, where a faint light still glowed, the rhythmic sound of washing paddles marking hours of labor from people he'd never thanked, whose names he'd never learned. Funny what your brain focuses on when it's drowning in alcohol. His room was on the other side of the river, just across the bridge. Maybe 300 feet. The fog thickened as he approached the water. The Sacramento River generated its own weather at night, white mist that swallowed street lamps and turned solid objects into ghost shapes. The bridge had no railings. Those had rotted away years ago and never been replaced. Just open air, then a 3-foot drop to the river below. James stepped onto the wooden planks. They were uneven, some newer, where replacements had been added, creating a surface like piano keys of different heights. Sober, you adjusted without thinking. Drunk, each one was a potential disaster. Below him, the river whispered and rushed. The Sacramento in spring, fed by snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada. Fast-moving, cold, deep. The sound seemed to pull at him. Just a little farther, he mumbled. Just get home. But what was home? An empty room. An empty bed. An empty life. The thought opened a door he'd been trying to keep closed. Emma's fever-bright face. Sarah's hand growing cold in his. The doctor saying there was nothing more to be done. The sound of dirt hitting coffin lids. His vision blurred not just from alcohol. His chest heaved with a sob he'd been holding back for 6 months. His foot came down wrong on an uneven plank. His ankle turned. He staggered sideways, arms windmilling. For a split second he might have caught himself. But the alcohol had destroyed his reflexes. The heavy coat pulled him off center. The weighted gun belt shifted his balance. The waterlogged boots had no traction. His right boot slipped completely off the plank. He reached for a railing that wasn't there. His fingers closed on fog. His weight came down on a rotted plank at the bridge edge. It had been waiting for just enough weight at just the wrong angle. Crack. The sound was sharp and final, like a bone breaking. James Dalton fell backward into darkness. The fog swallowed him. For a heartbeat he was suspended in air, his coat spreading like dark wings. Then gravity won. The cold was instantaneous and total. Not refreshing. Not bracing. Brutal. His body went into immediate shock. His lungs seized trying to gasp, but pulling in river water instead. The whiskey that had made everything numb suddenly didn't matter. This cold cut through everything right to his bones. In 3 seconds, everything that had been weighing him down became actively trying to kill him. The wool coat absorbed water like a sponge, ballooning around his arms, wrapping his torso like a straitjacket. He tried to pull it off, but the buttons were too small, his fingers too numb, and his brain too alcohol-soaked to coordinate the movement. The tall leather boots instantly filled with freezing river water. Each boot now held about 3 pounds of water, turning his feet into anchors. The tight fit that had been fashionable on land now meant he couldn't kick them off. The chaps absorbed water and clung to his legs, restricting movement, making it impossible to kick effectively. The wet leather wrapped his thighs so tightly he couldn't spread his legs to tread water. The gun belt, 8 pounds of steel, pulled at his waist like a lead weight. One revolver worked free from its holster and tumbled into the black water below. James thrashed. Not swimming, he didn't know how. Just pure panic. His arms slapped at the water. His legs tried to kick, but the boots and chaps made it impossible. He went under, once came up, gasping, went under again. The Sacramento River in spring didn't just flow, it moved. Fed by snowmelt, the current was strong enough to drag logs downstream. James was caught in it, now tumbling like laundry. He careened off a submerged rock. His shoulder screamed. He spun in an eddy, got turned completely around. His third time under, James stopped fighting. Not because he wanted to, because his body simply couldn't anymore. The cold had sapped his strength. The alcohol had poisoned his coordination. The weight of his clothing dragged him down. And maybe this was right. Maybe this was what he deserved. He hadn't saved Sarah, hadn't saved Emma. Maybe he didn't deserve to be saved either. The water closed over his head. The sound muffled. The cold became distant. Sarah's voice seemed to call from somewhere far away. Emma laughed that high, clear laugh. He let himself sink toward them. But his coat caught on something. A submerged branch from an old beaver dam. The branch hooked under his collar and jerked him to a violent stop. His head broke the surface. He gasped. Choked. Vomited river water and whiskey. Gasped again. The current still pulled, but the branch held. He was pinned half underwater, trapped in wooden arms, built by animals long dead. Hypothermia set in. His fingers blue, his lips purple, his thoughts sluggish, disconnected. He couldn't feel his feet, couldn't feel anything except the cold and a distant awareness that he was dying. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry, Emma. Darkness took him. Not death, not yet, but the edge of it. Dawn broke cold and gray. Winona Crowfeather walked to the river as she had every morning since she was 5 winters old. Summer's warmth or winter's ice, it made no difference. The water was teacher, healer, and test. It taught you to respect what could kill you, to move with nature, not against it. She wore a simple buckskin dress and moccasins, lightweight, practical. Her hair hung in 2 long braids, decorated with white eagle feathers, a mark of honor among her people. At 28, she'd earned those feathers through skill, courage, and the kind of survival that turned girls into warriors. The Lakota camp where she lived sat hidden in a grove of cottonwoods, maybe 20 people in 6 teepees. They'd left the reservation 2 years ago when the government beef rations, spoiled meat that killed more people than it fed, became too dangerous to accept. Her father Lakota had led them here to live in the old way, hidden, free, careful. Winona removed her moccasins and stepped into the shallows, her breath steady, as the cold water wrapped around her ankles, then her knees. This was ritual. This was meditation. She saw something in the water. Gray fabric like storm clouds, caught on the beaver dam her brother had partially dismantled last spring. She moved closer, squinting through the morning mist. A man, white, older, maybe 40, dark beard, fancy coat, expensive boots visible below the water's surface, dead probably. White men fell in the river all the time, drunk from the saloons, unable to swim, dragged down by their own clothing. She should leave him. Her people had every reason to let white men drown. The treaties broken, the buffalo slaughtered, the children stolen to boarding schools where they beat the Indian out of them, the reservations where families starved on government rations, meant to kill as surely as bullets. But her father's teaching echoed in her mind. A life is a life. The river does not ask if a man is Lakota or white before it drowns him. Neither should we ask before we save him. She watched for a long moment. Then she ran. The bullboat sat behind her family's tipi, a perfectly rounded vessel she'd crafted herself over 3 months. Bent willow branches formed the frame. A single buffalo hide she'd tanned with her own hands covered it. The hide, scraped soaked in brain solution, worked until it was supple, then stretched and lashed tight with wet sinew that dried hard as iron. Light enough for one woman to carry, strong enough to hold a full-grown elk. She lifted it overhead and ran back to the river. The man was still there, still caught on the branch. His face had a blue tinge. His lips were purple. But she saw his chest move. Shallow, weak, but moving. Still alive then. Winona set the bullboat in the water and climbed in, kneeling in the center the way her mother had taught her. The round boat didn't paddle like a canoe, it spun if you didn't know the trick. But she'd been doing this since she could walk. She navigated to the beaver dam using her paddle to position the boat behind the trapped man. Up close she could see the problem. His coat had absorbed so much water it looked like he was wearing a blanket of river. His boots were full, pulling him down. Leather chaps squeezed his legs. A gun belt she could see where one holster was empty dragged at his waist. White men, she thought. They dress for show, not survival. She hooked her paddle under his arm and pulled. Nothing. Dead weight. She tried again, bracing her feet against the boat's frame. This time he shifted slightly. She worked the paddle under his gun belt, twisted, and felt it come free. The belt slid down his legs and disappeared into the dark water below. Lighter now, but still too heavy. She pulled her knife, a small blade her father had given her, and cut the lacing on one of his chaps. Then the other. The leather loosened and she peeled it away, letting the current take it. The boots she couldn't remove. They were too tight, laced too well, and she'd capsize if she bent that far over. One more pull, putting her full weight into it, and the man's body came free from the branch. He was unconscious, mouth slack, water dripping from his beard. She dragged him partially into the bullboat, his torso across the frame legs, still trailing in the water. The boat sat dangerously low, now the buffalo hide flexing under the weight. One wrong move and they'd both go under. Winona's arms burned as she paddled toward shore. The round boat wanted to spin. The current wanted to take them downstream. The man's weight made every stroke twice as hard. But she'd been doing this her whole life. She knew how to read the river, where the current was strong, where it was weak, where the bottom was shallow enough to push off. Her father's words again. The river gives to those who respect her. Force her and she takes everything. 20 feet from shore, her paddle caught bottom. She pushed, drove the boat forward, pushed again. The bullboat's edge scraped gravel. She'd made it. Now came the hard part. She stepped out into knee-deep water and grabbed the man under his arms. He was heavy, even without the gun belt, and chaps, he still wore that waterlogged coat and those boots. She pulled her feet, slipping on river stones, her back screaming in protest. Inch by inch, she dragged him onto the bank. He lay there like a corpse, face, gray lips blue, not moving. Winona knelt beside him and put her ear to his chest. A heartbeat. Faint, irregular, but there. She rolled him onto his side and river water gushed from his mouth. He coughed weakly but didn't wake. She looked at him, really looked. 40 years old, maybe more. Weathered skin that said he'd spent his life outdoors. Calloused hands marked by rope and leather. A working man. A rancher or cowboy. The fancy coat and boots suggested he'd once had money or at least pride. but the smell of cheap whiskey still clung to him even after his river bath. And there was something else in his face, even unconscious, a kind of emptiness, a giving up. She'd seen that look before. On her husband's face in the weeks before he died on the reservation, on her mother's face after the soldiers came. It was the look of someone who'd already decided the world had nothing left to offer. Winona made her decision. She grabbed the man's arms and began dragging him toward camp. When James opened his eyes, he didn't know where he was. Not heaven. He was fairly certain. Heaven didn't involve this much pain. Every muscle screamed. His lungs felt like they'd been scoured with sand. His head pounded like a blacksmith was using it for an anvil. He was lying on something soft furs, maybe inside some kind of tent. No, not a tent. A tipi. The conical shape, the hide walls, the smoke hole at the top where gray morning light filtered through. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The world spun, his stomach heaved, and he collapsed back onto the furs. You awake? Good. Thought maybe you'd die. The voice came from his left. He turned his head carefully and saw her. A native woman sitting cross-legged by a small fire, hands working a piece of leather with practiced rhythm. She didn't look at him, just continued her work as if white men washed up on her riverbank every morning. She was maybe late 20s, strong-featured with long black hair and 2 braids. She wore a buckskin dress that was practical, not decorative. Her hands moved with the kind of efficiency that came from doing something 1,000 times. James tried to speak. His throat was raw, his voice a croak. You saved me. River saved you, pushed you to Beaver Dam. I just pulled you out. Her English was clear, touched only lightly with an accent. Why she paused in her work and finally looked at him. Dark eyes, intelligent and assessing, still deciding if that was mistake. James looked down at himself. He was wearing buckskin, a shirt too large for him, breechclout, nothing else. His clothes hung nearby, still dripping. His boots were there, empty of water now, but probably ruined. His coat was spread over a frame, steaming slightly in the warmth from the fire. Where are my guns? River has them. And your leather chaps? And your belt, all too heavy. You want to drown again, you buy new ones. Despite everything, the pain, the confusion, the humiliation, James almost smiled. It was the first time anything had felt even slightly amusing in 6 months. What's your name? Winona. Means firstborn daughter. You James Dalton. Why you try to kill yourself, James Dalton? The question was so direct, so matter-of-fact, that it took his breath away. I wasn't. I didn't. But the protest died in his throat. Because she was right, wasn't she? Maybe he hadn't jumped off the bridge on purpose, but he'd been walking toward death for 6 months. The whiskey, the grief, the not caring. It was all suicide, just in slow motion. I lost them, he said finally. My wife, my daughter. Fever took them. 6 months ago. Winona nodded slowly, her hands resuming their work on the leather. Everyone here know grief. Soldiers killed my mother. Sickness took my 2 brothers. My husband died on reservation 8. Government beef got poison. We all have. Dead people in our hearts. The simple honesty of it, the acknowledgement without pity, made something crack in James's chest. Before he could respond, an older man entered the tipi. He was maybe 65, weathered face marked by sun and wind-long gray hair, and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at James for a long moment, then spoke in Lakota to Winona. She answered in the same language. A brief exchange, then the man turned to James. I am Dakota. This is my daughter you owe your life to. She says you have grief sickness, that you tried to drown it in white man's poison water. His English was thickly accented but clear. You stay until you strong. You work. You learn. You respect. Then you go. But you no bring soldiers, no bring trouble. You understand? James looked at the old man, then at Winona, then back. What choice did he have? Yes, sir. I understand. Good. Winona, he is your responsibility. You save him, you keep him alive. Dakota ducked back out of the tipi. Winona stood and brought James a wooden bowl. Drink. Iswasna dried meat berries fat. Will make you strong. The mixture looked unappetizing, but James was starving. He ate slowly, and despite its appearance, it was surprisingly good. Filling, substantial in a way saloon food never was. How long was I in the water? He asked between bites. Don't know. I find you at dawn. How long before that? She shrugged. River doesn't care about white man's clocks. I should get back. My ranch hands will be worried you stay. Cannot walk 10 feet without falling. Your body is shocked from cold. Lungs full of river. You need 3 days, maybe 4, before you are strong. James started to protest, but his body agreed with her assessment. Just sitting up had exhausted him. He lay back down on the furs, and despite everything, the strangeness, the fear, the uncertainty, he fell asleep almost immediately. The deepest sleep he'd had in 6 months. 3 days became a week became 2. James's strength returned slowly. Winona treated him with willow bark tea for the fever that came on the second day. The cold water had shocked his system. She used sage smoke to clear his lungs. Buffalo fat salve for the skin on his hands and face that had been damaged by the cold. He began to observe the camp. 6 tipis, about 20 people. Mixed ages, elders, adults, children. They'd left the reservation, Winona explained, when the government rations became too dangerous to eat. They lived in the old way now. Hunting, gathering, trading carefully with sympathetic whites when necessary. They were cautious around James at first, understandably, but he kept his head down, helped where he could, and asked permission before doing anything. Slowly, the wariness eased. One morning, Winona found him examining the bullboat. "You want to understand it?" she asked. "I want to understand why I'm alive," he said, "and this boat is part of that." She showed him the willow frame, how it had to be cut in early spring when the sap ran strong, making branches flexible. How to bend them into a perfect circle, lashing joints with wet sinew that tightened like iron when it dried. She showed him the buffalo hide. "One hide," she said, spreading her arms wide. "From one buffalo we make tipi cover, winter robe, moccasins, rope, parfleche bags, drum shields in this boat. White man kill buffalo, take tongue, leave rest to rot. We use everything. Waste nothing. That is difference." Sitting there, hands covered in brain tanning, paced the traditional method for softening hides. James realized something. For the first time in 6 months, he hadn't thought about Sarah and Emma for an entire hour. The guilt hit him like a fist. Winona saw it in his face. "Grief is like river," she said quietly. "Cannot stop it, cannot fight it, can only move with it. Let it carry you until you reach new shore. How do you know about grief? Everyone here know grief. We all lost someone. But we still here, still living, because dead people would not want us to die with them." The words settled over James like a blanket. Not comforting exactly, but real. True. That night, Lakota announced a game night, a monthly tradition. The entire camp gathered around the central fire. "You know hand game, Winona?" asked James. He shook his head. "I teach you. Is like your poker, but louder." The game was deceptively simple. 2 teams, men versus women. 2 small bones, one marked, one plain. One team hid the bones, passing them back and forth under a blanket, while the other team tried to guess which hands held the marked bone. But the psychology was complex. While hiding the bones, the team sang haunting rhythmic chants that rose and fell. Hand drums beat in sync with heartbeats. Players swayed, made gestures, used sign language to communicate without words. It was hypnosis disguised as a game. James joined the men's team. He was terrible at first, his guesses random, his hiding obvious. But Winona coached him between rounds. "No think, just feel. Let your body lie for you." The betting was serious. Knives, blankets, horseshoe nails, valuable trade goods. Lakota bet his prized coup stick. Winona bet the silver bracelet her mother had left her. The game went to a final round, men down by 6 points. James held the bones for the last hide. He met Winona's eyes across the fire. Dark, intelligent, challenging. She tilted her head. "I see through you, white man." He smiled, the first real smile in 6 months, and closed his fists. The drums beat faster. The singing grew louder. James felt alive, not happy, not healed, but alive. Winona pointed to his left hand. He opened it. Empty. The women's team erupted in celebration. James laughed, a real, genuine laugh that surprised him as much as anyone. Later, as the camp settled for the night, Winona found him. "You knew which hand," he said. "Yes. Then why'd you guess wrong?" She smiled. "Because you need to win something, and because camp need to see white man can laugh. Make them trust you more." James realized she'd thrown the game to help him, not from pity, but from understanding. The next morning, James watched the young men practicing. They rode at full gallop, leaning off their horses' sides, touching each other with decorated sticks, whooping and laughing. "What are they doing?" he asked Winona. "Is bravery game. We call it counting coup. In old days, warriors ride into battle. But killing enemy from far away, that is easy. Real courage is to touch living enemy with coup stick and ride away. Prove you so skilled, so fearless you could have killed, but chose not to," she continued. Your people think courage is taking life. My people think courage is giving mercy when you have power to kill. Warrior who count many coups, who touch many enemies, and spare them, that man is truly brave. That man control his fear and his anger. James thought about the men he'd killed, rustlers mostly. One gunfight in Abilene. He'd thought himself brave for surviving. But he'd never once considered that walking away might take more courage than shooting. Dakota's grandson, Chayton, rode over. Old Cowboy, want to try? See if you have courage or just bullets. The challenge was playful, not hostile. James found himself nodding. They gave him a borrowed horse. He was used to riding with a saddle, but this horse had only a blanket. Chayton had the coup stick. The rules were simple. Chayton would try to touch him. James had to evade without falling off. The entire camp gathered to watch. Chayton came at him like lightning, horse and rider moving as one unit. James jerked his horse left too hard and nearly slid off. The camp roared with laughter. Not cruel laughter, the kind you share with friends. Multiple passes followed. James got touched 3 times in the first minute. But he learned. Started to anticipate. Started to feel the horse beneath him. Final pass, James managed to duck, and Chayton's stick swung over his head. After Chayton clapped him on the shoulder hard the way young men do. Not bad for old white man who cannot swim, James laughed, catching his breath. Give me 10 years and I might actually dodge you. Something had shifted. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was just a man learning new things. That evening the camp held a blanket toss, another celebration game. A large buffalo hide stretched between many hands used to launch people into the air. Children went first, screaming with delight. Then adults. Dakota, despite his age, volunteered. They tossed him 10 feet high. He landed perfectly and bowed. The crowd turned to James. Now, Cowboy. You try. He hesitated. Not from fear of heights or looking foolish, but from fear of feeling joy. Did he deserve that? Did he have permission to be happy when Sarah and Emma were gone? Winona walked over, stood close. You allowed to be happy. You're dead, they know, want you to die with them. They want you to live for them. James stepped onto the hide. They lifted him once he bent his knees. Twice he felt the power of many hands working together. 3 times and suddenly he was flying. The night sky opened above him, stars sharp as knife points. For 3 seconds he wasn't a man drowning in grief. He was just free. He landed, stumbled, fell on his ass. The entire camp erupted in laughter and cheering. James laughed so hard tears streamed down his face. Couldn't tell if he was laughing or crying or both. Winona helped him up. Their hands touched hers, rough from work, his scarred from years of ranch life. She pulled him to his feet, but neither let go. The camp noise faded. Just for a moment there was only firelight in her eyes and the strange, terrifying feeling of wanting to live again. You feel it? She asked softly. Feel what your heart is beating again. James realized she was right. For the first time since Sarah and Emma died, he wanted to see tomorrow. Not because the pain was gone, it would never be fully gone, but because maybe there was room in his heart for both grief and hope to live side by side. 2 months after Winona pulled him from the river, reality returned. A rider approached the camp, a U.S. Marshal named William Cord. James's former friend, searching for him. The ranch hands had reported him missing. His coat and gun belt had washed up downstream. Everyone assumed suicide. James emerged from the tipi to meet him. Marshal Cord's jaw dropped. Jim, what in the hell? Everyone thinks you're dead. They spoke privately outside the camp. Your ranch has been in probate for 6 weeks, Cord said. No will, no heirs. The bank's getting ready to auction it to cover your loans. If you don't come back now, you'll lose everything your family built. The ranch, Sarah and Emma's legacy, their graves were there. Jim Cord continued carefully. I don't care how you live your life. But folks in town, they're gonna talk. You living here with these people, with that woman. Her name is Winona, James said sharply. And these people saved my life when my own kind left me for dead. I know. I'm just saying. It's gonna be complicated. James knew he was right. The world outside this camp wouldn't understand. Wouldn't care that Winona had given him back his life. Wouldn't see the healing that had happened here. That night he told Winona about the ranch. She nodded unsurprised. You will go back? I don't know. I could handle the ranch business. And then no. You go back, you stay back. That is how it works. You don't know that. Winona was quiet for a long moment. Then she told him about her husband, Thomas Blackbird. Mixed Lakota white, tried to live in both worlds. Moved to the reservation during a harsh winter, promised it was temporary. Got sick from spoiled government beef, and died in 3 days. Before he die, he say to me, I should never have left the river. I should never have tried to be something I am not. Now I die in white man's world and lose my spirit from old world. I am nowhere. She looked at James. You are white man. River gave you gift new lifetime to heal. But you cannot stay in river forever. Eventually you must return to your shore. That where you belong. What if I don't want to belong there anymore? Want is different from belong. Your wife, your daughter, they rest on that land. Their spirits there. You leave that land, you leave them. You know this is true. She was right. He knew it. Could you ever? Would you consider coming with me? Winona's answer was gentle but firm. To live in white man's house, wear white woman's dress, be called squaw by your neighbors, who spit when I walk by. Watch my father die alone because I chose white man over my people. She touched his face. I save you because River brought you to me. I teach you because you have good heart, but I cannot leave my people for you, just like you cannot leave your dead for me. We are gift to each other, but not forever, only for now. 3 days later, the camp gathered for James's departure. Dakota spoke. You came here dead, man. You leave here alive, man. That is good. You show respect. You learn our ways. You know steal, you know lie, you know bring trouble. For this we give you name. He held up a coup stick simpler than his own but decorated with markings James had helped carve. A horse. A river wave. A sunrise. We call you Mini Yuani Hanpi. Means, given back by water, you died in river. River decide. No, this man not finished. River push you to us. We pull you out. Now you return to your world, but you carry our name. You carry our teaching. Remember, courage is not taking life. Courage is choosing life when death look easier. The camp women presented him with a buckskin jacket they'd sewn. Lakota designs decorated the shoulders. Inside a hidden pocket, they'd placed Sarah's lavender sachet recovered from his ruined coat, symbol of both worlds, both parts of his heart. Winona brought him a gift, a small bullboat perfectly crafted the size of a large bowl. I make this after I save you. Remind you when you drown again, not in water, but in grief and anger and fear. Remember there is always boat to carry you through. You just have to trust it. Their goodbye was restrained but powerful. She placed her palm against his chest over his heart. He covered her hand with his own. They stood like that, feeling each other's heartbeat. You will have good life, Winona said. You will marry again. Have more children. This is what I want for you. How do you know? Because River gave you back. River no waste gifts. 5 years later. Spring 1879. James Dalton's ranch thrived. Expanded operation. New barn built with some Lakota ventilation techniques. A school building on donated land. He stood by the river, the same spot where he'd nearly died. He came here every spring. He'd learned to swim. Chayton had taught him during visits. The young Lakota warrior now served as a bridge between James and the camp, helping establish trade routes that kept supplies flowing to the families who'd refused reservation life. James held the miniature bullboat in his hands. He thought about Winona's words. Grief is like river. Cannot stop it, cannot fight it, can only move with it. He'd loved Sarah completely, Emma with every breath. Their loss would always be part of him like a scar that never fully faded. But he'd been given an unexpected gift, understanding that love wasn't about possession or eternity. It was about connection, however brief. Sarah and Emma had been his shore. Winona had been his current. Both had shaped him. Both had saved him. He placed the miniature bullboat in the water and watched it float downstream. It didn't sink or capsize, just moved with the current, steady and true. Later that week, Chayton brought news. Dakota had died peacefully last winter. The camp had been pressured to move to the reservation, but Winona refused. She lived near the river still, with 2 other families helping them survive outside the system. Chayton handed James a bundle. Inside, a full-sized bullboat paddle, beautifully carved into the handle, Pidamayai. Thank you. And for giving old boat new purpose. WCF. James understood. She was still saving people. The river was still her home. He didn't ride to find her, that would be selfish. Instead, he helped Chayton establish better trade routes. Insured supplies reached her camp, sent money anonymously. It wasn't romance, but it was love in a different form, respect and support. James walked back toward his ranch. The pain of loss was still there. It would always be there. But it no longer defined him. He'd learned to swim, not just in water, but through grief, through despair, through the kind of darkness that drowns most men. And he'd learned that sometimes the river that takes everything away is the same river that gives you back to yourself. He was alive, truly alive, and that was gift enough.